Frankie Lymon died alone on a bathroom floor with empty pockets and a needle in his arm. He was 25 years old. The boy who had once sold 3 million records, who had screamed fans tearing at his clothes in the streets, who had earned more money by age 14 than most families would see in a lifetime, died in his grandmother's Harlem apartment with no one there to hold his hand. When the funeral came, the record executives who had made fortunes off his voice did not attend. The bandmates who had sung beside him stayed home. The millions of people who had bought his music moved on years earlier. Frankie Lymon was buried in an unmarked grave, forgotten by an industry that had used him up and spit him out. But this is not just a story about addiction or bad luck. This is a story about theft. It is a story about powerful men who saw a child with a gift and decided to take everything he had. It is a story about a broken system that chewed up a 13-year-old kid from the projects and made millions while he got nothing. And it is a story that should make you furious, because the people responsible for destroying Frankie Lymon never faced consequences. They lived in mansions. They drove luxury cars. They died rich and comfortable while Frankie died with nothing. How does that happen? How does one of the most famous teenagers in America end up buried in an unmarked grave with no one at his funeral? The answer is uglier than you think, and it starts long before Frankie ever stepped into a recording studio. It starts in the hallways of a Harlem tenement building where a group of boys sang for spare change, dreaming of something bigger. It starts with a man who heard that voice and saw dollar signs instead of a human being. And it ends in a courtroom decades later, where even after Frankie was dead and buried, the men who stole from him made sure they kept every cent. This is the true story of Frankie Lymon. Not the sanitized version. Not the fairy tale. The real one. The one where talent is not enough. The one where hard work does not save you. The one where the system is rigged from the start, and if you are young and black and poor, you do not stand a chance. Frankie never stood a chance. And by the time you reach the end of this story, you will understand exactly why. Franklin Joseph Lymon was born on September 30, 1942, in Washington Heights, New York. His father Howard worked as a truck driver, hauling freight for wages that barely kept the family fed. His mother Josephine cleaned other people's homes as a domestic maid, scrubbing floors and washing dishes to bring in whatever extra money she could. The Lymons lived in a cramped Harlem tenement apartment where the walls were thin, the heat barely worked in winter, and every dollar was spent before it arrived. There was never enough food. There was never enough space. There was never enough of anything. Frankie learned early that if he wanted something, he had to work for it. By age 10, he was delivering groceries after school, hauling heavy bags up narrow staircases for tips that amounted to pennies. By 12, he was running errands for local gamblers and numbers runners, doing things he knew were illegal because his family needed the money and no one was going to help them. He never complained. He did what he had to do. Music was the only escape the Lymon family had. Howard sang in a gospel group called the Harlemaries, and the apartment was always filled with the sound of harmonies and hand clapping and voices rising together in joy. Frankie absorbed it all. He learned to sing before he learned to read. His voice was pure and high and clear, the kind of voice that made people stop and turn their heads. In 1954, at age 12, Frankie attended a talent show at Stitt Junior High School in Harlem. He was not planning to perform. He just wanted to watch. On stage that night was a street corner vocal group called the Premiers, a ragtag collection of neighborhood kids who practiced their harmonies wherever they could find space. Frankie introduced himself after the show and asked if he could join. The lead singer, a boy named Herman Santiago, heard Frankie sing one verse and said yes on the spot. The group had a new member. In 1955, the Premiers were rehearsing in the hallway of a Harlem apartment building because none of them had living rooms big enough to hold 5 teenage boys. A man named Richard Barrett walked past, heard them singing, and stopped cold. Barrett was the lead singer of a popular rhythm and blues group called the Valentines, and he knew talent when he heard it. He told the boys he would help them. He said he knew people in the music business who could get them a real audition. He said this could be their shot. He was right. But what Richard Barrett did not tell them was that the people he knew were going to destroy them. Richard Barrett arranged an audition with George Goldner, the owner of G Records, a small independent label that specialized in rhythm and blues. Goldner had money, connections, and a reputation for finding hits. He also had a severe gambling problem and ties to some very dangerous people, but the boys from Harlem did not know that yet. Before the audition, two members of the group, Herman Santiago and Jimmy Merchant, wrote a song. They based the lyrics on love letters left behind by a tenant in their apartment building who had just gone through a bad breakup. The letters were sad and romantic, filled with questions about love and heartbreak. One line stood out. It asked why birds sing so happily in the springtime, as if they were in love. Santiago and Merchant built a melody around that line, crafting harmonies and verses until they had a complete song. They called it Why Do Fools Fall in Love? In September 1955, the Premiers walked into G Records to audition. But there was a problem. Herman Santiago, the original lead singer, either arrived late or had throat trouble. The details have been disputed for decades, but the outcome was the same. Santiago could not sing. Frankie Lymon stepped up to the microphone and said he knew the lead vocal part because he had helped refine the melody during rehearsals. He opened his mouth and sang. George Goldner had heard thousands of singers. He had produced dozens of records. But he had never heard anything like Frankie Lymon. The voice was a boy soprano, high and pure and angelic, but with a rough edge that made it perfect for rock and roll. It was the sound of innocence colliding with rebellion. It was the sound of something new. Goldner signed the group on the spot with one condition. Frankie Lymon had to be the permanent lead singer. In December 1955, the group entered Bell Sound Studios in New York City to record Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The session producer suggested changing their name from the Premiers to the Teenagers, a name designed to target the exploding youth market of post-war America. The record was released in January 1956, and it became an instant sensation. It hit number 1 on the Billboard Rhythm and Blues chart. It climbed to number 6 on the pop chart. It reached number 1 in the United Kingdom. The song sold over 3 million copies in its initial run. Frankie Lymon, a 13-year-old kid from Harlem, became the first black teenage pop idol in American history. His face was on magazine covers. His voice was on every radio station. He was famous, he was beloved, and he was about to be robbed blind. When George Goldner filed the copyright paperwork for Why Do Fools Fall in Love in early 1956, he committed fraud. He listed himself and Frankie Lymon as the sole songwriters, completely erasing Herman Santiago and Jimmy Merchant, the two boys who had actually written the lyrics and melody. This was not a mistake. This was theft. By claiming authorship, Goldner gave himself the legal right to collect 50% of all songwriting royalties for a song he had not written. Frankie was 13 years old. He did not understand contracts. He did not have a lawyer. He trusted the man in the suit who told him everything was being handled properly. Santiago and Merchant were even younger and more naive. When Goldner offered them $1,000 in cash to sign a legal release form giving up all future royalties to the song, they signed it. $1,000 for a song that had already sold 3 million copies. $1,000 for a song that would generate millions in royalties for decades. They had no idea what they were signing away. They just saw more money than they had ever held in their lives, and they took it. In 1957, George Goldner's gambling debts caught up with him. He owed money to the wrong people, and he needed cash fast. He sold his stake in G Records and Roulette Records to a man named Morris Levy. Levy was not a music executive. He was a mobster with documented ties to the Genovese crime family. He used the record business as a front for extortion, loan sharking, and money laundering. The first thing Levy did after taking control was remove Goldner's name from the songwriting credits of Why Do Fools Fall in Love and replace it with his own. Morris Levy had not written the song. He had not been in the room when it was recorded. He had never even met Frankie Lymon when the song was released. But he had power, and power meant he could take whatever he wanted. Frankie Lymon was still a minor, which meant that under New York law, his earnings were supposed to be placed in a court-supervised trust fund until he turned 21. The money would be protected. It would be waiting for him when he became an adult. That is what the law required. That is not what happened. Goldner and Levy never opened a trust fund. They told Frankie's parents that the money was being held safely in a corporate account, and because Frankie's parents had no education and no legal representation, they believed it. The trust fund never existed. The millions Frankie earned disappeared into Morris Levy's pockets, and Frankie never saw a dime. By 1957, Levy and Goldner decided that Frankie was more valuable as a solo act. During a European tour that year, they forced him to perform alone over pre-recorded backing tracks while his bandmates watched from backstage. The plan worked exactly as intended. The other members of the Teenagers grew resentful and bitter. The group fell apart from the inside. In September 1957, Frankie quit the Teenagers. He was 15 years old, and he was on his own. Without the vocal harmonies of the group, Frankie's solo records sounded hollow and incomplete. His follow-up singles failed to chart. Radio stations ignored him. The fans who had screamed his name 2 years earlier had already moved on to newer, younger stars. Then puberty hit. Frankie's voice dropped from a boy soprano to a baritone. The audiences who had loved the cute child act rejected his adult voice. By 18, Frankie Lymon was a has-been. Broke, abandoned, and desperate, Frankie turned to heroin. He developed a severe addiction that would control the rest of his short life. In 1957, while performing on a televised variety show, Frankie danced on camera with a white teenage girl. The backlash from segregationist Southern affiliates was immediate and brutal. The network canceled the entire show. Frankie's career was over. Throughout the 1960s, Frankie cycled through failed comeback attempts, arrests for theft and drug possession, and 3 marriages that ended in legal chaos. His only child, a daughter named Francine, died 2 days after birth. In 1966, a judge gave Frankie a choice between prison or military service. He chose the army and was stationed in Georgia, but he went absent without leave repeatedly to play low-paying gigs for drug money. The army discharged him dishonorably. In February 1968, Frankie's manager secured one final recording session with Roulette Records in New York. It was his last chance at a comeback. The night before the session, terrified that his adult voice would fail him, Frankie locked himself in his grandmother's bathroom and injected heroin. It caused a fatal cardiac arrest. On the morning of February 27, 1968, his grandmother found him dead on the floor. He was 25 years old. No record executives attended his funeral. No former bandmates showed up. He was buried in an unmarked grave because his estate had no money and the men who had stolen millions from him refused to pay for a headstone. In 1992, Herman Santiago and Jimmy Merchant won a lawsuit restoring their songwriting credits and were awarded $4 million. 4 years later, an appeals court overturned the ruling on a technicality. The rights went back to Morris Levy's estate. The thieves won. Frankie Lymon stayed in an unmarked grave for 17 years before fans raised money for a headstone. The industry he made rich never looked back.